and gentlemen, in the red corner, hailing from the state of Nevada, representing the Steam and Wise Guys, it's the always feared Vegas odds maker. And in the blue corner, the crowd favorite from South Florida, Mark Winning Picks Lawrence. And now, let's get it on!
Against the spread, Winning Picks with Mark Lawrence.
Hi, everybody. Mark Lawrence once again, along with Victor King, and we're set to go against the spread on this weekend NFL and college football cards. And Victor, if you can believe it, we're already into the month of October, this 2022 football season.
Right, Mark. We're 1 month into the season, and it wasn't one of those 6-0 weekends last week that we had. Pretty much a middle-of-the-road weekend, I think, probably for your service and our service. But with that said, at least somebody won his highest rated game of the week while somebody did not. And for me, yeah, I'm a little bit salty. Here we are, about 3 days after the weekend's games, and I still got one that's kind of sticking in my craw. And for us, Mark, it was our 5-star best bet on over the total in the NFL game between Buffalo and Baltimore. A game that really had a lot going for it, except for the fact that it was one of the 2 NFL games that was severely impacted by the remnants of Hurricane Ian. The Philadelphia-Jacksonville game, in addition to the Buffalo-Baltimore game, both were pretty much played in very windy conditions with pretty much a steady and nasty rain throughout the entire game. And while I will never blame weather when I want to play in regards to a total, especially the fact that we were looking pretty good in our game. The over-under line was, 50 points? Yep. It was 20-10 at the half. And in fact, the game was 20-20 with 4 minutes to go still in the third quarter. At that point, I thought we were fine. We could pretty much count each team to get a touchdown, and maybe it'll be 27-27. It might even go into overtime. But that was not the case. In the last 19 minutes of that game, there was only 3 total points scored, a Buffalo field goal, and it turned what looked like a exciting win for us into a very, very frustrating loss. There was some questionable coaching decisions in the fourth quarter of that game. Both teams had a 1st and goal inside the 10-yard line and came away with 0 points. So here we are on Wednesday, and I'm still a little salty about that one, Mark.
Well, Victor, I can relate a little bit to that. Not that it soothes the pain any at all, but I'm participating in a contest in Las Vegas. It's sponsored by Circa and VSiN. It's called an Invitational Football Contest. And one of the leaders in the contest had an overplay on a football game, a college game, and I can't recall which one it was. But anyway, he went over 62 total points, and he had 54 at the half and did not cash the ticket.
Wow.
Yeah, so there can be some bad beats in this world, and it sounds like the Baltimore-Buffalo game, while it isn't quite totally bad beat, it sure was ugly to the point where it sure looked like you had a winner midway through the third quarter of that football game.
Hey, we'll get over it, Mark, that's for sure. But with that said, I got to take my hat off to this guy here who did win his highest rated play of the week. That was his 4-star play in the NFL on the San Francisco 49ers in that Monday night game against the Rams, a game San Francisco absolutely dominated. It was Mark's revenge game of the month. They got their revenge from that NFC Championship game loss against these very same Rams. And again, a great way to finish the week, Mark, with that 4-star best bet winner on the Niners.
Well, thank you, Victor. That helps, keeps our winning run going here throughout October. And as I'll mention later on in the show, our October Rama double 5-star is off to a real nice start. Now 9-2 to begin the month of October. We'll have more details on that in just a bit later on in the show. Let's talk a little bit, Victor, if we may, about what happened last week in the world of college football. And while there weren't all that many upsets, major upsets per se, marquee upsets, There also weren't all that many what I call inside out stat results. And I absolutely love this time of the year when it comes to handicapping football games, because now we've got a full complement of at least 4 games under our belt for each team. The teams are statistically taking form, and we have patterns that we can look for and see and develop. I just didn't get enough of those results last week, but there's still plenty of them out there. Just as a slight for instance here, the Philadelphia Eagles in the NFL, hopping over that side of the ball, have held every opponent to a season low yardage mark this year. So they're playing really equally as well as their record indicates. But in college football, I didn't see a lot of that last week. Was there anything that caught your eye in the college football play last week?
Not too much. I would agree with you. There were 3 previously undefeated teams who lost their first game of the season and thus dropped in the current college football rankings and polls. That would be Kentucky, who dropped 6 spots, NC State, who dropped 4 spots, and Washington, of course, lost to UCLA in that Friday night game, who dropped by 6 spots. And of course, we want to welcome a couple more undefeated teams into the top 25 for the first time this season. Those undefeateds are TCU at 4-0, UCLA, who we just mentioned, is now 5-0. Can't believe I'm saying this, but the Kansas Jayhawks are 5-0 and are now number 19 in the country. Good for them.
Rock chalk
And don't forget the Syracuse Orange as well, who were previously unranked and are now ranked at number 22 with their 5-0 record. According to my math, we're still at 16 undefeated teams through 4 or 5 weeks of the season. And one more thing that I noted, and no, Auburn didn't fire their head coach last week, but we did have a surprise firing, and that would be Paul Chryst, who was fired from Wisconsin. A surprise, definitely. If you had any comments about that, Mark, I'd love to hear them.
Well, I will use my Judge Judy phrase, which she likes to paraphrase things, and say there were 2 words that come to mind about that firing, and those 2 words to me were absolutely sinful. Paul Chryst did not deserve to be fired at Wisconsin. He's done a terrific job with that football program, and it's just a classic case. And I'm going to go back to the Ohio State football days and games when they had their head coaches, Earl Bruce and the like, and they were winning football games at 70, 80% clips, but it wasn't enough to satisfy the alumni. And Wisconsin wasn't doing enough to satisfy the alumni despite Paul Chryst's sterling record with that football program. And yes, they did lose an ugly football game. But just go look at his body of work and everything he's done with the program there. That was absolutely disgusting to see them have to fire him and send him a pink slip along the way. One comment I want to make here, Victor, on and about last week's football card, and I think there is a coach that deserves to be fired. Maybe not a head coach, but at least an offensive coordinator. And I'm talking about Brian Ferentz at Iowa, Kirk Ferentz's son, who was the offensive coordinator. And when he appointed him as the offensive coordinator last year, they were rolling along pretty good. They were number 2 ranked in the country, but lo and behold, here comes Brian, and he instills this offense that just puts people to sleep. And what did they end up doing? They ended up losing 4 games after being ranked number 2 in the country. They lost their bowl game, and they're off to a pathetic start this year, at least offensively. They're ranking number 130 overall in college football this year, averaging just 16 points a game. Now, this is a defense that does not deserve the offense that Iowa's giving them, okay? So the question is nepotism a part of the factor at Iowa? Will Kirk Ferentz let his son go, or at least reposition him to another coaching position? Because guess what, guys? Kirk Ferentz could do a whole lot better with an offensive coordinator that brings something to the playbook, something to get people excited about, and it's not happening at Iowa. Now, I'm crying sour grapes here, okay? We used Iowa as a 5-star in the newsletter. I use them as a 4-star on my phone service. And looking at the way the game played out, maybe it wasn't as close as the final score, but still, I mean, they held Michigan way under their total yards, and they can't get this offense to wake up at Iowa here, and something needs to be done. That's my rant, my coaching rant, at least, from what I saw on the college football card last week. Any rants that you have, Victor, before we hop over to the NFL side of things?
No, I would agree with you. It's definitely frustrating in regards to Iowa, averaging only, 242 offensive yards per game. Guess what other NCAA bottom feeders are averaging more yards per game than the Hawkeyes.
Oh,
We got teams like New Mexico, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Mexico State, a down Colorado, a down Nevada, a down Temple. It's embarrassing, and he's got himself a different situation that he faces, again, with his son being the offensive coordinator of that team.
well, we'll see if something doesn't happen between now and the end of the year. And if things don't pick up there, I'm almost certain something will happen. There'll be a change at Iowa sooner than later. Let's hop over to that NFL side of things. And Victor, just like I mentioned in college football, again, there weren't all that many what I call inside-out games in the National Football League last week. And in fact, there weren't all that many upsets in the National Football League last week. So safe to say it played pretty true to form, the National Football League did last week. But I want to comment on one thing that one of our listeners, one of our big devout fans, Jeff Kabasiak, the guitar man up in Edmonton, Canada, he sent this email over here, and I want to read the email to everybody because it's really spot on. He said, I've never watched so many questionable, boneheaded coaching decisions as I've seen this season, be it on gambling on fourth down with a gimme field goal to take the lead in the fourth quarter, or a poor use of timeouts by rookie head coaches, analytics. What gives in the National Football League this year? And I think he's spot on with his observations here, Victor. We're seeing a lot of questionable calls by head coaches in the National Football League this year. And I'm just wondering if analytics is an overriding decision-making that way this year in the National Football League. I know there have been adjustments made as far as over-under totals are concerned and reasons why. I'll let you carry the ball with that in that regard here. But I agree with Jeff. We have to question some of the moves that are being made by these head coaches in the National Football League this year. And a perfect case in point has to be John Harbaugh with the Baltimore Ravens, who have now lost 5, and I said 5 consecutive home games in a row.
That's amazing. And this was a team that a lot of people were saying would be that one of the best teams in the AFC conference this season. You mentioned it wasn't a great week for underdogs, Mark. 8-7-1 ATS for underdogs overall last week. Not so well for the division dogs who went 1-3. Again, it was the non-division variety that had the profits. They went 7-4-1 against the spread. And in terms of year-to-date results, they're starting to jump out. 35-25-3 for underdogs on the blind on the season. That's 58%. Again, it's the non-division dogs who have improved all the way up to 66%, going 25-13-2, including 15-6-1 on the road, 71%. We mentioned it last week. We're on a 2-year historic run in which non-division road dogs have done very, very well. And the one more thing I want to add in terms of the NFL, Mark, is the fact that the headline for this week's Totals Tip Sheet newsletter is the fact that, yes, scoring was up last week in the NFL, 49.2 points per game. A lot of people are saying, yay, we're getting back to those historic 2020 numbers when we had the highest scoring season of all time. Don't buy it. Don't buy it one bit. Even though last week's games averaged 49.2, there was still only 8 unders and 8 overs on the week. When you see that, when you see a high scoring week and yet the over-under results are balanced, you have to assume that there was a couple of high scoring games that really throw things off kilter, and that was definitely the case. I mean, there was 93 points scored in that Detroit-Seattle game. It was the 15th highest scoring game of all time in the NFL, and that'll really skew the numbers. And so will the 72 points scored in that Kansas City-Tampa Bay Sunday night game. If we eliminate those two really, really high scoring games from the mix, then last week's results were only 44.4 points per game. And that, again, is right in line what we've been seeing for the entire first month of the NFL season, in which there's been 26 overs, 37 unders, 1 tie. That's 60% under the total, only 43.8 points per game. That is about 4 points per game less. Mark, we've talked about some of the reasons in the last few weeks. Again, this is the 5 point per game drop compared to last season. It's lower than any season in the NFL since 2010. A lot of people are asking, where did the points go? Well, number one, the changes can be primarily attributed to the changes in the passing game. You're seeing these new defensive coverages out there, the cover zero coverage, the cover one coverage, the cover two coverage that forces or funnels everything into the interior of the field and dares the quarterback to throw a little 5 yard pass. You're not going to get a lot of high scoring games when everything is funneled into the middle, not to mention the fact that teams are having great rushing success this season as well, Mark. In terms of passing, NFL teams are combining for 462 passing yards per game. And I say only because that's the second lowest total since 2012. And it's about 30 yards less per game in passing yards compared to 2021. We're seeing more defenses blitzing this season. 39% of all plays have been blitzes. That's a big jump over the 10-year average of 27% over the last 10 years. And not only that, and this kind of ties in finally to Jeff's comment, our guitar man in Canada, and what you were talking about is that people are screwing up in the red zone as well. There have already been 11 red zone fumbles just through week 3 of the season. It's tied for the second most in 2011. So again, you're seeing teams getting to the red zone and turning it into 0 points.
Great observation from Victor about what's going on in the National Football League this year. And Victor, I love your comment about not taking on the surface what you saw last week to be exactly what the rule is. That's what I call aberrational handicapping. And in those totals you mentioned last week, while that looked like it appeared to be a decent scoring week, it was because there was 1 or 2 games that were aberrations. They were just much higher scoring than the other games. And if they weren't there, everything else would have watered back down to a much lower score. I love doing aberrational handicapping in the second half of seasons. And what I will do, I'll pass this along to our viewers and our listeners out there, is if you look at teams' logs in the second half of seasons and you take and you throw out their very best and their very worst efforts of the season going into the second half of the season, you'll find then a true mean for that football team, because a team can bust out. A Seattle Seahawks can gain 555 yards in the game. You can rest assured I'll be tossing that yardage figure out in the second half of the season and get more down to what Seattle is all about when it comes to averaging their offense out. So keep that in mind. I call it aberrational handicapping, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we move into the second half of the football season. One quick note here, Victor, before we go to our I should say our college football game of the week. As we do on the segment each and every week this week, we always share with you a theme that we have from our good friend Steve Crabb in Dallas, Texas, also known as the Texas Tornado. And a good theory and thought that he has is always fading the most embarrassed team in the National Football League each week, looking for them to wipe that egg off their face, if you will, and also going against the public who reacts to those most embarrassing moments. And scanning the card up and down this week, Victor, I got to be honest with you, I don't see a most embarrassed football team on the card this week. It might have been the Green Bay Packers had they lost to New England and not won that game in overtime. And had they not won that game in overtime, it would have completely wiped out the survivor pool at the Circa. We'll talk with Andy about that a bit later on the show. But let me ask you this. Do you see any embarrassed teams in the National Football League moving forward this week?
Well, one can make a case that Tampa is a little bit of an embarrassed team against Kansas City, in that Tampa played a defense on Sunday night in which they wanted to literally take Patrick Mahomes out of the game. We're going to give you every single run possible. And Kansas City in that game ran for 190 yards on 37 attempts. So you can make a case with Tampa Bay being a little bit embarrassed, losing at home by double digits. In fact, losing their second consecutive home game in a row. So that's probably the only other team I would potentially throw in there, Mark.
I would agree with that, Victor. I have to probably say, if there was a team, and if it's not by default, it could well be Tampa Bay, in that was their second consecutive home loss in a row. They're going to close out a 3-game homestand this week against the Atlanta Falcons, who are flying pretty high off that win over the Cleveland Browns. And if there's a one-way street type football game, might it be the Tampa Bay Bucks this week? I think so, but let's stay tuned and we'll see exactly how that game plays out. You're tuned in to Mark Lawrence Against the Spread, the nation's most popular sports handicapping talk show. I'm visiting with Victor King from King Creole Sports. And with that, Victor, let's move on over to our college football game of the week. We've got a beauty on tap. It really doesn't get any better when you involve two Southeast Conference East Division teams that have a lot of bragging rights within that conference. We're going to pair Alabama up against Texas A&M. Victor, what's your take on this football game between the Tide and the Aggies?
Right, we've got some definite storylines in regards to this game, some drama involved as well. I do want to point out that our producer, Greg, did just send me a note that there was another college football coach fired after last week, and that was Carl Dorrell of Colorado, who was fired. And that's not a surprise. They're not doing great. In fact, the start to their season was pretty historically bad anyway. So, yeah, that is the other coach that was fired last week as well. And we are getting into, Mark, this is normally the time of year that we talk about the Red River rivalry, or we call it the Red River shootout between Oklahoma and Texas. I think for like 10 years in a row on our podcast, we always made that our top-rated college football game to discuss of the week. But folks, it's not happening this year. Neither team is even ranked, so we're going to have to pass on the Oklahoma-Texas game. I'm sure you'll be okay with that. In fact, we got a lot more drama in this Alabama-Texas A&M game. The point spread has Alabama favored by about 24 points. The over-under line opened at 52. It's dropped just a half point. The last time I looked, it was at 51.5 points. We have injury question marks, and it doesn't get any bigger than quarterback Bryce Young of Alabama, who is currently still questionable for this game as we record the podcast here on late Wednesday afternoon. But does he have an impact in regards to Alabama over-unders? He definitely does. Now, in regards to the series, this has been a really extremely high-scoring, uncharacteristically high-scoring series as of late, as in each of the last 4 years, the game has gone over with the total when Bama plays the Aggies. In 2021, last year, there was 79 combined points and went over by plus 29 points. In 2020, there was 76 combined points. It went over by 21.5. In 2019, there was 75 points. The game went over by 14. And then finally in 2018, there was 68 points scored in the Bama A&M game. It went over by 8.5. So each of the last 4 years, the game has gone over the total by an average margin of plus 17.3 points per game. Alabama on the season 2-3 over under. They've gone 1-2 at home. They've gone 1-1 on the road. Significant is the fact that in their 3 home games this season, Alabama has allowed a total of only 10 points. Now, before we load up on the under, consider the opposition in those games as well. We always have to provide proper context. Those 3 home games were against Utah State, L.A. Monroe, and Vanderbilt. Now, Texas A&M, on the other hand, they are 1-4 over under on the season. They've gone 0-4 at home. They went 1-0 last week on the road against Mississippi State, a game that went over the total by 3 touchdowns, 21 points. It's still a little deceiving because we do have to point out that Mississippi State had like 3 freak scores in the game. They had a blocked field goal attempt for a touchdown, a punt return for a touchdown, and then a 76-yard bomb from Will Rogers for a touchdown as well. So those over numbers for an A&M last week, a little bit deceiving if you ask me. Bottom line for me, Mark, is when I play Alabama over the totals, they are usually A, when the Tide is on the road, and B, when they're playing an opponent that we can count on with an above-average offense to score 17 or more points. I can't count on the Aggies to get to that specific number, so we're going to lean under in this one for now. We're going to follow the status of Bryce Young. If we find out he's definitely not playing on Saturday, we may up the ante. Either way, we'll lean under with the Tide taking on the Aggies.
Well, as Victor says, leaning under, especially with Bryce Young's status up in the air right now at the moment as we're doing the show this particular week. But what concerns me in this football game is this. You know, I know, the world knows that Alabama has had this game circled since last year when A&M stopped their 19-game win streak, and it also snapped Nick Saban's 24 straight win streak against former assistants. That obviously made this circled in red ink, if you will, for Nick Saban coming into the contest this particular year. So we get all prepared. We're all ready to make a case here for Alabama, Nick Saban here, and what happens coming this week. Number one, Bryce Young, the quarterback, iffy. Number two, take a look at what happened to Alabama last week in that Arkansas football game. They allowed Arkansas to score 23 unanswered points in that football game. Yes, they did win, and yes, they did cover, but 23 unanswered points, that's not what you expect from the number one best ranked team in the country. The other thing that concerns me is this, the timing of the football game. And I say that because what it just happened to be week number 6 for Alabama and for a lot of other college football teams. And in our Playbook football newsletter this week, one of our favorite Smart Box segments is a piece we call the 5-0 Fat Cats. And when you talk about 5-0 Fat Cats, there you go. Victor's showing you what that piece is right there. A lot of great information inside of that. What it involves is teams that, when they open up the season 5-0 in Game 6 and they come favored, they're Fat Cats, man. They just simply don't perform in football games, and they've really, really sputtered laying points in this particular Fat Cat role. So that all works against Alabama in this football game. Now, do we want to step up and pull the trigger on the Alabama Crimson Tide here, knowing that we're laying Jimbo Fisher more points than he's ever got in his career against any team at any stage of his college football career? That's a really, really dicey question if you ask me. I'm not going to fade the Smart Box, okay? I'm just simply not going to do that. It's only because the Smart Box wins. It turns out winners grinds out profits, and I'm not going to step in front of it and say this week is not going to grind out that particular profit, or this game is not going to grind out that particular profit. So I'm either going to play in this football game A&M plus the points or take a pass. A little bit like Victor here, you know, there wasn't a lot of conviction to the under. There's not a lot of conviction for me to Texas A&M, but I'm certainly not going to step in front of that Smart Box with this football game. So put me down for A&M plus the points or pass on this football contest. You're tuned in to Mark Lawrence Against the Spread, the nation's most popular sports handicapping talk show. Victor and I were going against our college football, or going on the college and NFL football cards this weekend. And Victor, let's hop over to the National Football League side of things for our NFL game of the week. And we've got a football game that might not on paper look to be a very marquee type game. But then again, if you look up and down this week's NFL football schedule, there aren't all that many marquee type football games. But I think this one will prove to be exciting. It was very exciting last year when the Cleveland Browns took on the Los Angeles Chargers in a wild, high-scoring football game with each team scoring 40 points in the contest. The Browns eventually lost the game, which eventually cost them a spot in the football playoffs here. Victor, how do you see the Browns and the Chargers in this rematch on Sunday?
This should be a fun game up in the lakefront, that's for sure, Mark. Before I do get into our segment here, you mentioned the Playbook newsletter, and there's also a really good article, you know, on page 2. Mark always does the musically themed Bet You Didn't Know. And this week's article is the Bet You Didn't Know, The Sound of Silence, for you Simon and Garfunkel fans here. And it's a great article. It tells you to fade some of the teams. And since it applies to one of the teams down here in South Florida, it's great reading down here as well. So you definitely want to check that out. In fact, all 3 of our newsletters, we just got the midweek alert. There's the totals tip sheet. There's the Playbook newsletter. The cover price for all 3, $38. But we have a special where you can get all 3 newsletters for just $25. It's our triple play of newsletters, and you're definitely going to want to check that out at the website. They look fantastic when you print them out in color as well. Let's get into the NFL game. The Chargers favored on the road against Cleveland. They open up as a 2-point favorite. They're up to about a field goal right now. The over-under line opened at 48.0. It's come down a half a point to about 47.5, and we're leaning under. And, you know, I'm an old school guy. It's still very difficult for me to fathom high over-under lines for Cleveland Browns games, as great of an under team as they have been over the last 10 years. Last week it was 48.5 against Atlanta. We used Cleveland Atlanta under as a 3-star play. It won pretty easily. We said there'd be 70 or more rushing plays in that game. There were. So again, when I see Cleveland Browns games with high over-under lines, it's still a little bit confusing to me. Now, on the season, the Chargers, the road team, they're 2-2 over/under. They went under the total in their first 2 games. They've gone over the total in each of their last 2 games, including that road win last week against the Houston Texans. Cleveland comes in as a 3-1 over/under team. They have gone over in each of their 2 home games. They've gone 1-1 on the road. On the offensive side of things, yeah, we got a couple of pretty good offenses here. The Chargers, number 7 ranked offense, 372 yards per game, 23 points per game. Cleveland even better, number 4 offense in the NFL, 385 yards per game, an excellent balance of rushing and passing, and a surprisingly productive season from Brissett at quarterback for the Browns as well. Now, again, with that said, Mark, we're going to be going under in this particular game, and most of it is based on one of the articles that we wrote this week in the Totals Tip Sheet newsletter. We're getting into that time of the year in the NFL where we start seeing these west to east zone situations, where a West Coast team travels across 3 time zones and has to play in a Sunday early game against an Eastern time zone opponent. That is happening this particular week. We wrote about it again in the Totals Tip Sheet newsletter, and it's gone 78% under the total over the last 15 years. And what you're asking for is game 4 or greater, West time zone teams who are favored on the road, like the Chargers, against any East time zone opponent. If the game is played on a Sunday, these games have gone under the total again, 78%, with the Chargers favored by 3 in the game. That's the way we're leaning. Another situation with the Chargers off a high-scoring road favorite win last week. I went into the database and checked that out. And teams who are favored on the road for the 2nd week in a row, after winning by double digits on the road in a game that went over the total, like the Chargers, these teams have gone 1-12 over/under over the last 10 seasons.
Nice.
They've gone under by an average of 8 points per game. Obviously, we're leaning under. We're going to also follow the injury concerns for the Browns in this particular game, Mark. And if we find out that defensive ends Myles Garrett and Jadeveon Clowney play, then we're going to bump this under up even more. I say that because not only are they great for the defense, not only are they great pass rushers, but both of them are great run stuffers as well. So we'll be going under in this game. We may even bump up our dollar amount if we find out that Cleveland's great 2 defensive linemen are playing in this game.
Victor goes under this total, looks for a reversal from last year's 47-42 score to stay under the total this year when the Chargers invade the North Coast to take on the Cleveland Browns on Sunday. What we've got working in this game here, looking at the side perspective of the contest, guys, is we have a total of 15 teams in the National Football League this year that have started the season 2-2. That's the most ever in National Football League history, and these are 2 of those teams, a pair of 2-2 teams, making this game critically important to both football programs here. Victor mentions here the Cleveland Browns situation here with their stud defensive linemen being out of the football game last week, and in fact, all of their starting defensive linemen were out in the Atlanta football game last week, and you had to give it to Arthur Smith. He saw it, he realized it, and he gouged the Cleveland Browns on the ground and just ran the football down their throat. Now, if you don't find these defensive front wall for the Browns playing again, the Chargers are the worst team in the National Football League in running the football. I don't believe there's anything they'll be able to do to take advantage of a situation like that. This is a personal observation, but we'll have to check the game time decision to see whether or not these 2 players from the Cleveland Browns do indeed play this football game. What the Cleveland Browns are is they happen to be one of only 4 teams in the National Football League that have won the yards in every football game they played this year. They're 2-2 in the football season, and you can make a case that they well could be 4-0 this season here. The loss to the Jets was absolutely horrific. That was a nightmare in the making in the way that evolved there. And the loss to the Falcons last week came also with asterisks with the injuries that they had and the manner in which they lost the football game. So they're playing as good a football right now as a lot of teams in the National Football League are the Cleveland Browns. They also just happen to be a team that owns the better offense, surprisingly, Jacoby Brissett. If you take a look, Justin Herbert, better offense, Cleveland Browns. And the better defense, the Cleveland Browns. And you know our axiom, better offense, better defense, you better take the points. And we'll do just that with the Cleveland Browns for our side in this football game on Sunday. You're tuned in to Mark Lawrence Against the Spread, the nation's most popular sports handicapping talk show. And it's time for us to hop out to Las Vegas to get the Vegas vibe from our good friend Andy Iskoe from TheLogicalApproach.com in Las Vegas. Andy, how's everything going for you in Las Vegas this football season?
It's going very well, Mark, both in the colleges with a nice week last week, and the pros have been pretty steady following the first week of the season, which was a little rough for a lot of us. And I just heard your comments about the Chargers and the Browns, and I've already made a play on the Cleveland Browns this week for many of the reasons that you enumerated, especially their tremendous ability to run the football, which makes me somewhat confident about their ability to take advantage of the Chargers, especially control clock. Herbert did look good for the Chargers last week in that win, but nonetheless in their win against Houston. But nonetheless, you made some very good points about Cleveland. Haven't had an opinion yet on the total, but I will take into strong consideration Victor's comments in that game.
Well, Andy, I'm glad everything is working out well for you in Las Vegas this week. I'm also glad you like our Cleveland Browns side of the football game. I have to throw that in there as well. And if we can catch up a little bit on what we do each and every week on the show, an updated standings on the Vegas contests. And I know we're going to talk about the Survivor, and when we do, I'm going to pinpoint you to one big question when we get there. Because I don't think a lot happened there last week. I'm only going to guess because of the results. But when we get there, I'll lay a question on you and see what your comment happens to be. But what did you see in the contest, the big boy contest in Las Vegas last week?
Okay, well, I'll start first with the Golden Nugget, the contest that combines both college and pro football. It's a little difficult to really get a consensus there. I think it's 128 contestants, and they get to choose from roughly 60 college games and the 16 games this past week when we have a full week of NFL games. So there's not a lot of players who would be on the same side, but I can give you the standings through the first 4 weeks of the contest, where they've made a total of 28 selections. There is one leader at 18 points out of the possible 28. 2 more are a half point behind. 8 are at 17. 3 are at 16.5, and 21 are at 16. And the reason I drop it off at that point is the Golden Nugget pays only the top 20 placers. Actually, the top 10 are the ones who make the money. 11 through 20 are the ones who get their $1,000 entry fee refunded. So right now, with those 21 tied at 16, there are 35 contestants out of the 128 in position right now to cash. But of course, we've only had 4 weeks down and 14 to go. Looking at the Westgate contest, the Super Contest Gold had 80 participants this year, and again, for that low number reason, it's not that significant as far as what the consensus plays are as compared to the Westgate Classic and the Circa Million. But the standings do have one contestant, 5 picks a week, 17-3 to start the season in the $5,000 winner take all. Another contestant is a half point back, one more at 16, and you've got 8 at 15. 5 at 14.5, and 7 at 14. That works out to a total of 23 contestants, more than a quarter of the field hitting 70% or better through the first 4 weeks of the season. And now let's turn to the Westgate Super Contest, the granddaddy, the Rose Bowl, if you will, of handicapping contests in Las Vegas. Maybe about 80 years behind the number of years that the Rose Bowl has been in existence. But nonetheless, it's been very popular. And even this year, after the COVID and the competition from Circa, it still drew nearly 1,600 entries. 1,598 to be specific. Coming into this past week, the consensus of the top 5 selections, a very solid 10-5. And this past week, week 4, saw the top 5 picks in the Super Contest Classic go a perfect 5-0, led by the Minnesota Vikings, the Dallas Cowboys, Arizona Cardinals, Tennessee Titans, and the Las Vegas Raiders. Top 5 picks, all 5-1, bringing the selections for the year for the consensus 15-5, 75%, which is nice. Unfortunately, it's only through 20 picks and not 80 picks, which would be really remarkable. We'll see where that stands in December. But right now, the consensus overall to not just a very good start, but nice and consistent start, because they've had winning weeks all 4 weeks, topped by the 5-0 this week. Looking at the 2 Circa contests, and we'll start with the Circa Million. That's the one with a $6 million guarantee prize payout, including $1 million for the winner. Similar in structure to the Super Contest, 5 picks a week against a static point spread. Overlay in this contest this year, they needed 6,000 entries at $1,000 each to equal the to fund the $6 million guarantee. So Derek Stevens and the folks at Circa are going to be came up a bit short. They it's about $1,300,000 overlay for the field, but I'm sure the folks over there. First of all, they did make their guarantee for the contest I'll talk about next, the Survivor, but they'll be pleased with all the publicity that they continue to generate around, well, not just the nation, but the world, actually, with the popularity of his 2 contests. For the Circa Million, the top 5 selections, the top 4 were winners this week, with the Vikings, Cowboys, Raiders, and Cardinals all cashing tickets. The one loser, the Pittsburgh Steelers, with their late loss to the New York Jets. Had they been able to hold off the Jets at the end, maybe even, well, they were able to foil even a field goal attempt, they would have pushed, as that line was Pittsburgh by 3. Still a nice 4-1 week to build upon the 9-6 start from weeks 1 through 3, 13-7 for that consensus through the first 4 weeks of the contest, which works out to a nice 65% for the consensus. And again, that's a consensus of 4,691 entries, and in fact, almost half the field, a little bit under half the field, were on 1 pick, and it was the Minnesota Vikings laying the 2.5, maybe getting a little bit fortunate at the end of that contest over in London. 2,042 were on the Minnesota Vikings last week.
Wow.
That's nearly 700 more than the second choice, which were the Dallas Cowboys, with a little bit about 1,350 selections on that one. So that's the update for the Circa Million contest. And then the one that you alluded to earlier, the Circa Survivor, which drew 6,133 entries. And this week, we saw 279 eliminated. The Packers barely survived, as they led the way with 699 contestants choosing the Packers. And of course, as you know, you can only use a team once per year in the contest. And this is a straight up contest to try and gain part of that $6 million pool if you're able to finish as the only one remaining at the end, or one of a group of a few. But it does reduce the number of teams that you can select from. So, for example, 4 teams were already picked by each contestant who's still alive in the first 4 weeks of the contest. Otherwise, Green Bay may have been a very popular pick, even more than just 689. Nonetheless, they survived with their overtime win against New England. The one top 5 team that went down, this or top 4 team that went down, the Steelers, 177 were eliminated with a pick on Pittsburgh. 169's top pick, or only pick, was Philadelphia, and of course they had their nice win this past week to remain unbeaten. The Los Angeles Chargers were the 4th most popular at 163 entries. That was a winner. And the number 5 pick was a loser. 91 contestants went out with the Detroit Lions with their upset home loss to Seattle. Other teams that were eliminated last week, 49 were eliminated when the Colts lost at home to Tennessee. Cleveland had 8 on their side in their loss at Atlanta last week. The Carolina Panthers were losers for 3 of the contestants in their shortcoming last week. And last week, after a couple of weeks where people didn't submit selections, nobody was eliminated for failure to make a pick in week 4. So 279 were eliminated. That leaves just 1,222 entries still alive of the more than 6,100, or a shade under 20% of the field remains after just 4 weeks of this contest.
Well, Andy, the question I was going to ask you, but you more or less answered it within your recap here, is we did not use the Green Bay Packers ourselves last week, knowing that they would be the obvious #1 choice in the contest for a couple of different reasons. And this might be strategizing. I want to ask your opinion on this. We opted for Philadelphia instead. And a couple of reasons. #1, we felt there was a better spot to use Green Bay down the road. And #2, had the Packers gone out, the field would have been cut in half from where it is right now. And the question I'm going to ask of you is, are we at the stage of this contest where it's better to be fading the most popular choices for fear of a broom coming in and sweeping them out and looking to use another play, or instead focus on the team that keeps you alive? That's the question.
It's an interesting question because there are 2 answers which are somewhat yes and no, because it depends upon your philosophy. The old Jim Valvano quote, "Survive and advance," suggests that you take the best team remaining according to your method of handicap or assessing the week schedule, and get that one into the next week, regardless of how many are with you, how many are opposite you, or how many are just on other games entirely. So that's one method, and that makes a lot of sense. One of the strategies that I talk to people who enter the contest, as I did myself, of course, I didn't get a chance to use the strategies as I went out in week 1 with the Tennessee Titans. Nonetheless, it is a strategy where people do look over the course of the season to try to pick out a handful of teams that they are prepared to play in any given week, keeping in mind you need to have at least 1 and potentially 2 or 3 of the 6 teams that play on Thanksgiving Day. And the same thing is true for the contest over Christmas weekend, where, if I recall correctly, there are games on a Thursday night game and 2 games on the 24th, 6 teams. So you want to make sure that you have teams available there, because if you don't have a team for that week, you automatically get eliminated because you can't select for those short weeks. So that's one thing that regardless of what strategy you use during the season, you want to pay specific attention to those 2 weeks where those 2 contest weeks, I should say, where they are just 3 games to choose from. So that's one thing that everyone should keep in mind, regardless of how you approach the unfolding of the season. Other folks will look backwards at the contest and say, okay, if I'm alive to week 20, the final week of the contest, which teams do I feel most comfortable having? And they might have 3 or 4 teams remaining. Keep in mind that of the 18 weeks, you're going to, of the 20 weeks in the contest, that means there are going to be 20 teams you will have to use, and only 12 that you may not want to use. Now, you may want to use some of those 12 picks. In other words, you may decide before the season starts, these are the 12 teams that right now I'm not looking to play at any time. I don't trust the Jets or the Giants or the Jags or the Texans or whatever teams you think are at the bottom of the barrel. But there may be an opportunity during the season where 2 of those teams meet one another, and you may want to use a team that you otherwise might not want to use. For example, let's take this week. Although the teams are playing better than maybe they were expected, even though Houston remains winless, they're at Jacksonville. Those are 2 teams that you might have thought at the start of the season, I can't see any place where I would use either of these 2 teams. You might want to use that this week and preserve, for example, a mid-level team like, let's say, I don't know, maybe the Minnesota Vikings or a team like that you might say, I don't know when I want to use them. But that's the other strategy. I tend to advocate, for the most part, especially if you have multiple entries still remaining, that you plan ahead and have a handful of teams each week, because you know what the matchups are each week. So you want to sort of scout out where you want to play certain teams. And you may very well want to start with looking at those 2 short weeks and saying, okay, I want to have, Dallas and whomever available for Thanksgiving, and, Green Bay and whatever team is available for Christmas. And then you work around those 2 teams for the rest of the season schedule.
Savvy advice from Andy Iskoe, joining us from Las Vegas, publisher of The Logical Approach football newsletter, one of the best on the market. You can check out that newsletter and all about Andy's services. Simply log on at thelogicalapproach.com. And Andy, it's that time of the show where our listeners would love to know what you've got on tap this week. A nice winning selection last week of the Las Vegas Raiders, I believe, moving your record to 3-1 thus far this football season here. Let's get to that 80% range with the winner this week. What does it look like, Andy?
Well, I'm going to go to a game that may be somewhat under the radar. I'm going to look at the game, Washington hosting the Tennessee Titans. Washington currently a 2.5-point home underdog. One of the keys for me for this game is for Washington to keep the score close in the first half. And the reason I say that is Tennessee has struggled greatly after halftime of their games this year. In fact, after outscoring Tennessee's the opposition in the first half 68-37 in the first halves of their games, the Titans have been outscored 64-7 after halftime, including 3 consecutive weeks in which they failed to score in those last 3 games. That tells me that it may be a case of a halftime adjustments failure for Mike Vrabel and the coaching staff to make adjustments. Maybe it's relaxing a little bit. They were up 24-10, as a matter of fact, in each of their last 2 games, both of which they held on to win 2 weeks ago against the Raiders, and then last week once again at Indianapolis. So that's a little bit of a concern. Washington is a team that has performed not quite as well as expected, but they haven't been embarrassing. I mean, yeah, they did get blown out by Philadelphia 24-8 in another game where Philadelphia also did not score after halftime, and Washington got the last 8 points. And then another game that they played, the game last week, where also they came up short at Dallas after keeping it competitive in the first half. But this is as much a play against Tennessee as it is on Washington. And the other thing that I like about this game is last week, Washington was a quote-unquote sharp play last week amongst a lot of the big professionals who took the 3, ultimately 3.5 at Dallas. And as I mentioned, it was a close game until Dallas ended up dominating the second half, winning 25-10. And I sometimes like to look at teams that the sharps are all over but fail with in 1 week. Sometimes they're just a week early. And maybe this is the week when Dallas gives the performance that they didn't give last week. I'm sorry, that Washington gives the performance this week that they didn't give last week, and may have soured a lot of people on Washington, when in fact, whatever made them the Sharps like about Washington last week may be evident this week. And again, they're getting a team that has struggled after halftime. And I think Washington is going to, at plus 2.5, a good part of the play will be on the money line, but I'll also be taking the plus 2.5 as well, in case we have one of those extra points that hit the crossbar, or a 2-point conversion that fails. Getting the plus 2.5. I'd like to get plus 3, but I'll settle for some of it on 2.5.
Like an unexpected pregnancy, the Washington Redskins peaked early last week, didn't arrive. Andy says they arrived this week. I concur with your selection, Andy, as well. I'd happen to like that play, and I think your analogy was spot on in addition to the play itself. So put me down for Washington. I'll put you down for our play on the Cleveland Browns, and we'll see where we meet in between now and next week.
That sounds great. I'm going to wish everyone a great week, and let's see. Let's see how many survive in the Survivor this week. It's surprising that 80% has been eliminated. I haven't assessed it yet as to what the popular play will be this week, but hopefully it'll be a game I won't be involved in.
Well, I hope so too, Andy.
And good luck to you, Mark, as you continue along, as you're part of the 80%. You're part of the 20% that still gets to advance.
Well, thankfully, knock on wood, we'll see if we can keep that ball rolling as well. Thanks, Andy. Have a great week. That was Andy Iskoe joining us from Las Vegas from thelogicalapproach.com with the Vegas vibe, as he does each and every week here on Mark Lawrence Against the Spread. And with that, before I move on to my awesome angle of the week on the show this week, let's turn over to our good friend Jim Feist, who's got a complimentary pick for our listeners and viewers out there now. Jim, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Jim Feist in Las Vegas for the Playbook show. Hello, Mark. This week, my team on the show is Wake Forest, a sizable favorite over Army. But I look for Sam Hartman to have an explosion like he did last year with 458 yards. He's had 15 touchdown passes in his last 4 games. I look for an explosion by Sam Hartman and an explosion and another win and cover for Wake Forest, who've covered 6 of the last 7. Big weekend. Have fun, collect the money.
Welcome back, everybody. Mark Lawrence along with Victor King as we go against the spread on this week's NFL and college football cards. And it's time once again for our weekly awesome angle of the week on the football card this week. And like we did last week, our awesome angle comes once again from the Playbook football newsletter, this time from our Bet You Didn't Know column. Victor referred to our Bet You Didn't Know column, and we're going to refer to that once again this particular week in college football. It comes from our Sound of Silence. And by the way, the Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, I just want to throw this out there. There was another version that was done, and I didn't come upon this until about 2 years ago, by a group called Disturbed, who I have no clue who they were or anything like that. But when somebody told me to go listen to the song, I was absolutely blown away by their version of Sound of Silence. So if you have a chance, go check it out. Sound of Silence by Disturbed. I think you're going to really like what you hear in that particular song. Nonetheless, let's move on to our awesome angle of the week on the show this week. And what we're going to do is to play against any college football favorite that's coming off a straight-up loss as a favorite of 20 or more points if they're facing a 400 or better opponent coming off a loss. We do that by fading these guys. We are 19-4-1 against the spread. That's an 83% winning angle. This week we'll be playing against the Pitt Panthers and on the Virginia Tech Hokies for our awesome angle play on the show this week. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Victor King from King Creole Sports to find out what Victor's got on tap this week. And Victor, if you do the honors with your complimentary play as well.
Sure thing, Mark. We're going to kind of work our way backwards. Again, we will have an over-under selection in the Monday night game. That's the AFC West battle between the Raiders and the Chiefs. 4-star NFL over of the week that will be available. It goes on Sunday. Don't forget the college football over-unders as well now. 7-2 on the season, 78% for our college over-unders. And we've got another over going in Saturday night action. Of course, all of our selections available right here at the website, playbooksports.com. And we're going to lay low this week with our 2 doggies. Poor Tuco is distraught. He's on a very, very rare 2-game losing streak. And this week he's been in the patio penalty box. So Tuco is going to lay low this particular week. With that said, though, we're going to be using the under in the Titans-Commanders game. And I know Andy just talked about the game, and he is on the home underdog side in this game. So we're going to kind of climb on his back and tag team him and go low in this particular game. And obviously the highlight from our database is the fact that you have a AFC team. It's laying points on the road against an NFC opponent. At last look, what they were favored by 2.5 to 3 points, Tennessee. In the last 3 seasons, AFC road favorites have gone an amazing 1-17 over-under versus any NFC opponent when the over-under line is reasonably priced at less than 54 points. That's 3 years, 1 over, 17 unders, and that's a great way to start here. Of course, Tennessee just pulled off that low-scoring upset against the Colts last week. 2-14 over-under since the 2018 season. Non-division road teams off a division road dog win that also went under the total. That applies to the Colts this week. Washington is struggling on offense. In fact, they've scored, only 8 and 10 points in their last 2 games. In the last 3 years in the NFL, NFC non-division teams who scored 10 or less points in each of their last 2 games have gone a perfect 0-7 over-under. That applies to the Commanders in this particular game. The clincher is the fact that Washington has been the ultimate underdog as of late. Their last 16 rolls as an underdog, they've gone 2-14 over-under. The line's at 42.5. Get your action in at that line. We'll be going Titans and Commanders under the total. I'm sure Mark has a free play, not to mention a big weekend in store, not to also to mention that big Octoberama special.
Yeah, Octoberama, Victor, we just price dropped Octoberama $100 down to $299. That'll get you 4 weeks of all of my selections for the month of October. Included will be, now get this, our 5-star college football game of the month, our 5-star NFL game of the month, this weekend's NFL Perfect System Play of the Year, and I'm also going to throw in Major League Baseball playoffs as a no-charge bonus. Check it out all online for our double 5-star Octoberama at playbooksports.com, or give our office a call toll-free. The number is 800-321-7777. And by the way, Victor's over-under play, that 1 in 17 stat. If that doesn't rock your socks, nothing else will. He had a winner last week with New Orleans. We'll see if he keeps that winning streak going alive on the show this week. Before I get to my complimentary play, I want to remind our listeners out there that our good friends at mybookie.ag are offering all Playbook podcast and videocast subscribers, listeners, and viewers a double first-time deposit bonus. All you need to do is log on at mybookie.ag. Use the promo code Playbook to get your double first-time deposit, mybookie.ag. And with that, let's get to my complimentary play on the college football card this week. Like last week when we used the Purdue Boilermakers, that was a play from our Playbook newsletter upset special. When we took the points against them with Minnesota last week, we're going right back with the Boilermakers this week as they take points from the Maryland Terrapins this week. And Jeff Brom, certain coaches just fit into certain roles, and Jeff Brom is just that. He's an awesome underdog in college football, especially in conference games where he's 16-7 to the spread in his career. And when his team's win percentage is less than 666 in the season, you can make that number 15-3 against the spread for Jeff Brom. On the flip side, you talk about coaches. Mike Locksley, the head coach from Maryland, is, get this, 0-13 straight up with just 2-point spread covers against teams that are coming off back-to-back wins. And if you put him up against a conference opponent that's off a conference win, that number drops to 1-16 straight up and against the spread for Mike Locksley. You put it all together with Purdue's 77 yards a game better defense. I'll grab the points of the Boilermakers once again for my complimentary play on the show this week. And by the way, be sure to check out our Playbook videos online. You can get all of my videos. You can just log on at pb.buzz/ML. pb.buzz/ML to get my complimentary video picks each and every day at playbooksports.com. For Victor King from King Creole Sports and our good friend Andy Isko joining us from Las Vegas from TheLogicalApproach.com. Until next week, once again, this is Mark Lawrence reminding you to always remember to bet with your head, not over it, and good luck as always.